I never planned for my life to change in a bookstore. Certainly not on a rainy Tuesday evening, wedged between trivia nerds and overpriced lattes. But fate doesn't always send warning signs or epiphanies wrapped in gold. Sometimes, it comes in the shape of a quiet woman with ink-stained fingers and a notebook filled with compass roses. I'd gone to Morrison's books more out of boredom than desire. My therapist had suggested I explore new spaces after the Mark breakup, a sterile way of saying, stop letting your apartment swallow you whole. 3 years with a man who flinched every time I mentioned a promotion or a passport stamp, who once told me I was too intellectual for comfort. I left that relationship with more questions than answers and a growing distrust in anything that resembled romance. So when I slipped into that dim-lit bookstore, I didn't expect anyone, least of all a woman, to tilt my world on its axis. The room buzzed with low chatter and the scent of old paper. Trivia night was already in full swing. I nursed a lukewarm vanilla latte, pretending to be invested in questions about Renaissance painters and obscure treaties. My blonde hair kept falling into my eyes as I doodled navigation symbols in the margins of my notebook, a habit left over from my thesis days. Old habits die hard when you've spent years breathing life into faded maritime maps. Then came the final question, the one that split my existence into before and after. What ancient navigation tool shares its name with a butterfly migration pattern? The host asked, his voice laced with faux hipster flair. My fingers tightened around my pen. The answer lit up in my brain like a flare in the dark. Magnetic declination, I said aloud, half rising in my seat. But another voice echoed mine from across the room. Same answer, same timing. I turned. She stood with an equal mix of confidence and surprise. A brunette, around my age, with striking blue eyes that pinned me in place like I was a specimen under glass. Her simple green sweater hugged her frame casually, yet something about her felt untamed like a storm behind her calm smile. The host laughed, announcing a tie. We both stepped forward. And in that moment, as our hands touched the same prize, a $25 bookstore gift card, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, electricity. Not the shallow excitement of flirting, not the careful calculation of post-breakup rebounds. This was something else. I introduced myself. Amelia Barnes, she replied, Kennedy Murphy, with a handshake that lingered just a beat too long. When I joked about her knowing butterfly trivia without being a lepidopterist, she grinned and said, I breed butterflies. I run a research lab on the east side. And just like that, the room disappeared. The awkward music, the scraping of chairs, the overhead lights all melted into background noise. I asked if she wanted coffee. My voice shook slightly. To discuss migration patterns, I added, pretending it was academic curiosity. She didn't laugh at the excuse. Just said, I'd like that very much. The next day's coffee became a 4-hour exchange of ideas, stories, and nervous smiles. I learned she'd spent the last 5 years tracking butterfly populations across threatened habitats, a blend of science and soul that made her eyes light up when she spoke. I told her about restoring maps, the delicate patience it required, and how I found meaning in preserving lost beauty. She listened like no one ever had. That night, I found myself smiling at the ceiling, heart racing like it hadn't since college. The next day, she showed up at my studio with a leather portfolio and a twinkle in her eye. I have a proposition, she said, stepping over scattered parchments and restoration tools. I watched her take in my workspace, the ordered chaos of maps, brass tools, aged paper curling under glass weights. She didn't judge. She admired. I need a map, she said, of North American butterfly migration, something visual for a conservation grant, but more than a map, a story told in ink. She opened the portfolio to reveal pages of her own research, detailed flight paths, handwritten notes, population data. I leaned in, the smell of lavender on her coat catching me off guard. Her notes were precise and beautiful. I suggested a historical overlay to show how patterns had shifted over a century. She nodded, our shoulders brushing as we bent over a chart. Climate change is erasing the past, she said. If we don't visualize it, no one will believe what we're losing. The commission would take weeks with Kennedy. I tried not to read into that. I'd love to see your lab first, I said, surprising myself. Understand your world before I draw it. 2 hours later, I stood in her greenhouse lab, a warm, buzzing cathedral of color and motion. Butterflies floated like living jewels through humid air, brushing against flowering vines and mesh enclosures. She moved among them like she belonged there, calm, competent, grounded. Each species has its needs, she said, cradling a fragile monarch on her finger. Some only survive at a specific temperature, some need certain light angles to breed. Her passion shimmered through every word. I watched her with quiet awe. How had I never met anyone like this? We grabbed coffee afterward, a second date disguised as a business meeting. She told me about a failed expedition in Panama where she got heat stroke and nearly lost two rare species. I told her about a map that revealed a shipwreck no one believed existed. We laughed. We paused. We stared too long. Before we said goodbye, she invited me on a weekend hike. "There's a trail an hour north," she said. "I spotted rare blues there last season. Want to come?" I hesitated. The word date danced on the edge of the sentence. "Are you asking me out, Kennedy Murphy?" She just smiled. "Bring your compass, Barnes." Saturday came with golden skies and that soft crispness of early autumn. She picked me up in a Honda that smelled like old books and wildflowers. The backseat was a tangle of field guides, nets, and butterfly specimen cases. "Prepared much?" I teased. She handed me a thermos of coffee. Always. 30 minutes into the drive, her GPS died. She cursed under her breath, pulling off into a dirt road framed by dense woods. "Shortcut," she said, biting her lip. Apparently not. I pulled out my grandfather's compass, a brass beauty I'd carried since I was 12. "Lucky for you, I trust analog." She watched me take a bearing like I was performing alchemy. We hiked northeast, crunching through orange leaves and beams of filtered sunlight. Kennedy kept stopping to explain things, the migration cycles of moths, how certain beetles pollinate early wildflowers. Her knowledge was endless, but it wasn't pretentious. It was joy, and something in that joy cracked me open. Halfway up a ridge, she turned to me. "This isn't a usual date, huh?" I blinked. "So it is a date." She didn't backpedal. "Do you want it to be?" Her honesty stunned me. Not because it was bold, but because I wasn't used to anyone being that emotionally available. I hesitated. "I've never," my voice trailed off. "Been with a woman," she finished gently. "Me neither, not seriously." There was no judgment in her tone, just shared uncertainty. We reached the summit as the sky blushed pink and gold. Kennedy laid out a blanket while I gathered kindling. We cooked simple food over a fire, the silence between us soft and welcoming. As we ate, we opened old wounds. She spoke of a man who left her for academia in California without saying goodbye. I told her about Mark and how ambition made me difficult. She looked at me then, not like I was broken, but like I was rare. "You're extraordinary," she said. They just didn't know how to see it. The fire cracked and hissed, painting her face in shadows. She reached across the blanket, touching my hand. "When I saw you at the bookstore," she whispered, "I didn't expect you to be real." I smiled. "I thought the same." Then silence, but not awkward. It was breathless, anticipating. Her hand slid into mine, warm, gentle, electric. And when she leaned in, her lips barely brushing mine, I forgot every label I ever carried. The kiss was soft, honest. No games, no fear. It didn't feel like something forbidden. It felt inevitable. When we pulled away, I was trembling, not from fear, but from a truth I'd finally allowed myself to feel. "Was that okay?" she asked, forehead resting on mine. "More than okay," I breathed. We stayed by the fire until the stars stitched themselves into constellations overhead. Her head found my shoulder. My fingers laced into hers. It was the quietest night I could remember, and in that quiet, something inside me shifted forever. The morning after was made of dew-soaked grass, cold air against skin, and the kind of silence that held questions too heavy for daylight. I woke to find Kennedy still asleep beside me, her arm draped loosely across my sleeping bag, her breathing soft and even. The fire had long since died out, leaving only the scent of wood smoke lingering in my jacket and the echo of our kiss alive on my lips. I lay there, unmoving, staring up at the pale pink sky that was just beginning to brighten behind the trees. Every rational thought in my head tried to scream for clarity, but instead all I could do was feel. My body was calm, my mind a storm of contradictions. I'd always defined myself in clean categories: straight, ambitious, practical. I'd planned every step of my life with surgical precision. And yet here I was, tangled in a blanket of uncertainty and unspoken desire, with a woman whose presence made all those careful plans feel irrelevant. Kennedy stirred beside me, her eyes fluttering open in slow motion, like someone surfacing from a dream she didn't want to leave. When she looked at me, her smile was gentle but unsure, as though she too was afraid to ruin the fragile magic we'd created. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice rough with sleep. I murmured something back, unsure whether it was a greeting or an apology. She blinked, realized the position of her hand on my side, and pulled back instinctively. "Sorry," she said, suddenly alert. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't," I interrupted softly. But my voice betrayed the ache of uncertainty clawing at my ribs. Because even as my words tried to be reassuring, the question that had haunted my dreams since that kiss returned in full force. What does this mean? We packed up camp in a strange choreography of avoidance, hands brushing but not holding, eyes meeting but not speaking what they wanted to say. On the hike down, we filled the silence with facts and trivia, like we were both trying to retreat into the safety of science. Kennedy told me how certain butterflies mimic others to avoid predators, how colors evolve to signal danger or camouflage. I nodded, asking questions I barely heard myself say. When we reached her car, the air felt thicker, heavier, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Kennedy smiled as she opened the passenger door for me, but there was something strained in it, something that didn't reach her eyes. The drive back was quiet, not uncomfortable, but fragile, like we were both tiptoeing across ice too thin to hold our weight. When she pulled up outside my apartment, I hesitated. "Thanks for the adventure," I said, forcing a smile. She looked at me like she wanted to say something more, but instead she simply nodded. "Anytime." And just like that, she drove off. No kiss, no promise, just the echo of yesterday lingering in the space between us. I walked into my apartment with a chest full of what-ifs and a head buzzing with confusion. The maps I'd left spread across my desk now looked foreign, like pieces from someone else's life. I sat down at my work table, pulled a magnifying glass over an 18th century trade route, and tried to pretend the compass inside me hadn't spun off course. But it had, and no amount of cartography could guide me through this new terrain. I thought about calling her, but what would I say? That the kiss meant everything, that I was terrified of what it meant for who I was, that I couldn't stop thinking about the way she looked in the firelight, or how her voice softened when she said my name. The next 2 days passed like fog, thick and untraceable. I kept busy with restoration work, diving into every tiny tear and faded letter with obsessive precision. But Kennedy was in every corner of my mind. Her laugh, her fingertips, her story. And just when I'd convinced myself that maybe it had all been a one-time anomaly, a blip in the emotional radar, she showed up again. Not with a grand gesture, but with a soft knock on my studio door and a cardboard cup of my favorite vanilla latte in her hand. "Peace offering," she said, her eyes cautious but hopeful. I nodded, and she stepped inside like someone re-entering a house she once built. For a while, we didn't say anything. She leaned against the table where my maps were spread out, watching me work. I felt her eyes on me, curious, warm, hesitant. Finally, I broke the silence. "I'm sorry I've been weird." "You haven't," she replied, "but I've been wondering what happened up there between us, if it was real." I looked up then, straight into the question she wasn't afraid to ask. "It was real," I said. I don't know what to do with it." Kennedy exhaled, her body relaxing by degrees. "Neither do I," she said, "but I haven't stopped thinking about you, about the way it felt, and I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." The vulnerability in her voice cracked something open inside me. I stood, closing the distance between us slowly, afraid of breaking the moment. "Neither do I whispered. "But I'm scared." She smiled, not a triumphant smile, but one of recognition. "So am I." We didn't kiss, not that day. But we talked, really talked. We sat on the floor of my studio with maps surrounding us like a protective spell and shared the pieces of ourselves we usually kept buried. I told her about how my father left when I was 9, how my mother buried herself in books and silence, how I learned early that independence was safer than needing anyone. She told me about growing up in a small town that didn't know what to do with a girl who liked bugs more than makeup, how her grandmother's garden was the only place she ever felt like she belonged. Our words were tender, raw, and slowly they started to make space for something new between us, something not yet defined, but no longer hidden. The following week was filled with the rhythm of quiet collaboration. I visited her lab again, this time not as a stranger, but as something else, something more intimate. She showed me how she tagged the butterflies with tiny markers for tracking, how she bred generations to strengthen traits threatened by habitat loss. I watched her in awe, the way she moved like a conductor in a symphony of wings and light. She, in turn, watched me as I translated her data into artistry, designing a map that was part science, part poetry. It became our shared project, our unspoken bridge. Every day we worked together, a little more of the awkwardness melted. But the undercurrent never faded. It pulsed between us like a quiet hum, desire, curiosity, fear. We didn't speak about the kiss again, but everything in our bodies remembered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the glass panels of her greenhouse and painted her lab in amber light, Kennedy handed me a notebook. "It was my grandmother S," she said. "Her butterfly journal, I think you'll appreciate it." The pages were filled with looping cursive, delicate sketches, and notes written in the margins like whispered conversations. I held it with reverence. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." Kennedy nodded. She believed in transformation. Said sometimes people are like caterpillars, hiding, waiting for the right moment to change. The metaphor hung between us, too perfect to ignore. I looked at her then, not as a friend, not as a client, but as someone who might be the catalyst for the kind of transformation I never thought I needed. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with her grandmother's journal in my lap, my heart unraveling memory after memory, question after question. What if love wasn't about fitting into boxes, but about letting someone see the parts of you even you didn't recognize yet? What if everything I thought I knew about myself was only a fraction of the truth? I thought about Kennedy's voice, the way it warmed when she talked about fragile things, butterflies, wildflowers, people. I thought about the way she saw me, not just as a woman, not just as a restorer of maps, but as a soul trying to find her own coordinates. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted her to help me find them. The next day, I showed up at her lab unannounced. My heart pounded as I stepped inside the greenhouse where she stood adjusting the temperature on a habitat. She looked up, surprised but not displeased. I crossed the space between us slowly, each step a silent vow. "I don't want to be scared anymore," I said. Her eyes searched mine, filled with something bright and unsure. "What do you mean?" I took her hand. "I mean I want to try us, whatever this is becoming. I don't know where it leads, but I trust you, and I trust what I felt on that mountaintop." Her fingers tightened around mine. "So do I." She leaned in again, no hesitation this time. Our lips met like a truth long buried, now finally unearthed. It wasn't about labels. It wasn't about what we had been. It was about what we were choosing to become. And in that kiss, surrounded by the wings of transformation, I knew something with perfect clarity. I wasn't lost. I was just evolving. There are moments in life that arrive quietly with no thunderclap or fanfare, yet they alter you in ways you can never fully map. For me, it was that second kiss, the one in Kennedy's greenhouse, surrounded by monarchs and blue wings drifting like petals in slow motion. That kiss wasn't about discovery anymore. It was about acceptance. A moment where all the noise in my head, the old rules, the definitions, the fear, fell silent beneath the warmth of her mouth on mine. After that night, we didn't make any declarations or draw any lines in the sand. We simply continued, as collaborators, as companions, as something unnamed but deeply understood. It felt both terrifying and natural, like sailing into uncharted waters with a compass that only responded to feeling. The following days passed in a golden rhythm. I would wake early, sometimes unable to stop smiling at the ceiling, the corners of my heart quietly unfolding. My work, usually a space of meticulous solitude, now carried traces of Kennedy. She left me voice notes with excited updates from her lab, sometimes mid-discovery, her voice bursting with joy over a new egg clutch or a rare larva behavior. I'd play them on repeat while working, each message like a pulse of electricity I didn't know I needed. In return, I'd send her photos of my sketches, hand-drawn overlays of historical routes merged with her migration data, spiraling into new patterns that felt almost alive. We were building something, not just a project, but a shared language. But even as our connection grew, the world outside didn't pause to give us space to figure it out. My friend Sarah, a fellow map restorer, noticed the change in me before I said a word. "You're glowing," she teased one afternoon as we cataloged 19th century trade maps. "Either you've discovered a new varnish formula or you're sleeping with someone who knows what they're doing." I laughed nervously, brushing her off. "It's not like that," I mumbled, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. "Her name's Kennedy, we're just working together." But Sarah raised an eyebrow, one of those looks that cut through denial like a scalpel. "Amelia, come on, you talk about her like she invented oxygen." I looked away, cheeks burning. "It's new," I said quietly, "and I don't know what it is yet." She didn't press, but later, as I was packing up, she touched my arm and said gently, "Just don't let the world shame you into silence. You deserve something real." That night, Kennedy and I sat cross-legged on the floor of her lab after hours, eating Thai food out of cartons while dragonflies tapped at the glass windows behind us. She told me stories from her childhood, of a science teacher who discouraged her from pursuing entomology, saying it wasn't feminine. Of being laughed at in high school when she presented a thesis on the migratory collapse of painted ladies due to pesticide poisoning. I listened, realizing how much strength it took for her to still be here in this lab, surrounded by the very creatures that had made her feel weird and too much for most of her life. "Butterflies always knew I belonged," she said, half laughing. "They never needed me to make sense." I reached for her hand, not for comfort, but for solidarity. "Maybe we're both figuring out how to belong," I said, "in places that never gave us the right map." The intimacy between us grew like roots under the surface, not rushed, not showy, but strong. We didn't define it. There was no need. We spent weekends hiking or wandering museums. She'd take me to old observatories where the stars seemed to listen better, and I'd take her to antique bookstores where I could watch her eyes light up at the scent of aged pages. One night, while watching a documentary on migration collapse, Kennedy turned to me with tears in her eyes. Sometimes I feel like I'm racing time, she said. Like every butterfly I save is a rebellion against a planet that's trying to forget them. I held her then, not to fix her, but to let her fall apart safely. We didn't kiss that night. We didn't need to. Intimacy had already rooted itself in the soil between us. Not everything was easy. With new love, especially love that bends the boundaries of everything you've known, comes friction. It began when my mother called. We hadn't spoken in weeks. She asked how I was, how work was going, and I mentioned cautiously that I'd been collaborating closely with a woman named Kennedy. "You sound different," she said. "Is she just a colleague?" Her tone was curious, not cruel, but it still triggered that familiar ache. That need to protect. I didn't correct her. I didn't say what I should have. That Kennedy had kissed me like I was something precious. That she saw me in ways even I didn't. I hung up the call feeling like I'd folded myself into a smaller box to make someone else comfortable, and I hated it. Kennedy noticed the shift that evening when I seemed distant during dinner. "Want to talk about it?" she asked softly, setting down her fork. I hesitated, then nodded. "My mom asked about you," I said, "and I couldn't tell her." Kennedy didn't flinch, but I saw the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. "It's okay," she said quickly, too quickly. "You don't owe anyone an explanation." But I heard what she wasn't saying, that she wanted to be seen, not hidden. I reached for her hand across the table. "It's not about shame," I said. "It's about unlearning fear, and that's going to take time." She nodded, squeezing my fingers. "I just don't want to be your secret," she said, barely above a whisper. "You're not," I said. "You're the truest thing I've found in years." That night we held each other longer than usual, her head on my chest, my fingers tracing the line of her back. And in the stillness I realized love wasn't just about falling, it was about choosing. Again and again in moments both easy and hard. Choosing to stay, choosing to grow, choosing to be honest even when it hurt, and I wanted to choose her, every single day. A week later, something unexpected happened. Our map, the one we'd been building together, won a grant from the State Ecological Research Council. The board praised its marriage of history and science, calling it a model for future climate communication. Kennedy and I were invited to present it at a regional symposium, an event packed with researchers, conservationists, media. It was the first time we'd be seen publicly as co-creators, and my stomach twisted with a mix of pride and panic. On the day of the presentation, Kennedy wore a crisp blouse and tied her hair up, her presence magnetic. I wore a navy blazer and my favorite antique compass pin. We stood side by side at the podium, walking the audience through centuries of cartography and current collapse. We spoke with fluency and passion, weaving our disciplines into a shared vision. After the applause faded, an older man approached us during the reception. He was a retired professor respected in the field. "Brilliant work," he said to me, then added with a smirk, "and I see you've brought your assistant along." I froze. Kennedy's smile didn't even flicker. "Actually," she said, "I brought my collaborator and co-author and the woman who made this project possible." The man blinked, stunned. I watched him retreat, then turned to Kennedy with something blooming in my chest, not just gratitude, but awe. "You always know exactly who you are," I said. She looked at me then, eyes clear and unwavering. "And I'm not afraid of being seen anymore, are you?" I didn't answer right away. I was still learning, still evolving. But I knew one thing with clarity: Kennedy Murphy was not just a chapter in my story. She was the map I never knew I needed. The days following the symposium were bathed in a kind of brightness that felt almost unreal, as if the world itself had shifted its axis and allowed light to fall on corners of my life that had long been gathering dust. Kennedy and I became inseparable in a way that felt natural, fluid, not rushed, but deeply rhythmic, like the familiar pulse of something destined rather than improvised. She would come to my studio early, balancing 2 cups of coffee on a clipboard filled with her notes, and I'd greet her with ink on my hands and a half-finished sketch on the drafting table. We would talk all morning, work until we forgot about time, laugh over spilled varnish, argue affectionately about map symbols, then grab sandwiches from the cafe below my apartment before returning to the studio like 2 scientists bent over a rare specimen. But beneath all that warmth, beneath the blooming connection we were weaving thread by thread, another feeling slowly pressed its way into the space between us, an unspoken fear neither of us was ready to name yet. It began with small things, unexpected hesitations, moments when Kennedy's gaze lingered on me a little too long, not in admiration but in quiet calculation. Times when I would reach for her hand but feel her retreat inward, folding herself small, like she was afraid she might ask for more than I could give. At first, I ignored it, convinced it was part of the natural uncertainty of something new. But as days turned into weeks, the subtle shifts became impossible to overlook. One afternoon, as we were examining old coastal migration charts, Kennedy suddenly went quiet, closing the folder abruptly. She stared at the floor as if searching for courage in the scattered dust. "Amelia," she said softly, "what are we doing?" I blinked, heart tightening in my chest. "What do you mean?" She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. The moment passed. She smiled a practiced smile and changed the subject. But something inside me registered the crack in her voice, the way she seemed to brace herself for an answer she wasn't sure she wanted. Despite the tension, our bond kept growing. We started spending nights together, not always physically close, but always emotionally intertwined. Some evenings we fell asleep watching documentaries on nocturnal insects. Other nights we lay side by side in my bed, Kennedy tracing constellations on my arm while I breathed in the lavender scent she carried everywhere. It wasn't the kind of intimacy that demanded touch. It was the kind that required truth. And truth for both of us was becoming harder to ignore. I found myself thinking about her constantly, not just the softness of her voice or the way she laughed when she was truly happy, but the courage she embodied when she stood up for what she cared about. I admired her. I wanted her. I feared losing her. And all these feelings wrapped themselves around me like vines growing faster than I could prune. One Friday night, Kennedy invited me to dinner at her apartment. It was the first time I'd ever seen where she lived. The space was small but warm, decorated with soft lighting, dried flowers, and shelves filled with scientific journals and field guides. Something about the intimate simplicity of it made my breath catch. She cooked pasta while I sat on the counter sipping wine and watching her move with the ease of someone who didn't need permission to take up space. The conversation was light, playful, filled with stolen glances and accidental touches that felt intentional. After dinner, we curled up on her sofa, my head resting on her shoulder. For a moment, everything was perfect. Then my phone buzzed. It was my mother. I froze. Kennedy didn't move, but I felt her awareness sharpen like a needle. I let the phone ring, then fade into silence. "You can answer," she whispered. "It's okay." But I couldn't, not because I didn't love Kennedy, but because I didn't know how to explain any of this to a woman who still believed I'd marry some respectable man with a steady job, someone uncomplicated, someone predictable. My silence, however, said more than any words could. I felt Kennedy's body stiffen slightly beneath me, not in anger, but in a kind of quiet hurt that seeped into the air like slow-moving fog. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled in a way that made my heart crack. "Do you always ignore her calls?" I swallowed. "Sometimes. Or just when you're with me?" The question sliced the room clean in half. I sat up, not ready for the confrontation, but knowing we couldn't run anymore. "It's not about you," I said. "It's about everything else." She nodded slowly, turning her face away from me. "I know I do, but I need to say something, and I need you to hear it without taking it as a demand." My chest tightened. "Okay." She folded her hands in her lap, the way she did when something mattered too much. "I don't want to be your secret, Amelia. I don't want to be something you tuck away because it doesn't fit the map you thought you had for your life." Her voice didn't break. It stayed steady, which somehow hurt more. "I want to be with you, fully, openly, and I know you're scared, I am too, but I need to know you're not going to disappear the moment it gets complicated." Her words hit me like a tidal wave, gentle but overwhelmingly true. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not accusation but vulnerability, fear, hope, everything we had been building hanging in fragile balance. "Kennedy," I whispered, I'm trying so hard." She nodded again, tears forming but refusing to fall. "I know, but your trying still feels like hiding." I wanted to explain everything, how I had spent my life fitting myself into expectations I never questioned, how stepping outside those lines felt like stepping off a cliff. But no explanation felt worthy of the pain in her eyes. Instead, I stood up abruptly, overwhelmed, pacing in front of her bookshelves. "I just need time," I said, voice cracking. "I need to understand myself before I can explain myself to anyone else." There was a long silence, not cold, not angry, just full of all the fears we had both buried for weeks. When I finally turned back toward her, Kennedy was wiping her cheeks gently, as if embarrassed by her own honesty. "I'm not asking for a label," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for a grand announcement. I just want to know you're choosing me, and not running because you're afraid of how the world sees you." My throat tightened painfully. I kneeled in front of her, taking her hands. "I'm not running," I whispered. "I'm learning, and I want you here while I do." She let out a slow, shaking breath. And then she did something that broke me open completely. She rested her forehead against mine, not in desperation, but in a gesture so tender it felt like a vow. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll learn together." The storm passed, or so I thought, because storms don't disappear with one honest conversation. They retreat, gather strength, and wait for a crack in the foundation. and ours came sooner than either of us expected. 2 weeks later, the greenhouse lab suffered a sudden power failure during a critical breeding cycle. Kennedy called me in a panic, her voice trembling as she explained that the temperature systems had shut down, risking the survival of 3 rare species she had spent months nurturing. I rushed to the lab, arriving breathless to find her kneeling beside the emergency habitat units, eyes wild with fear. "I can't lose them," she whispered, hands shaking as she tried to adjust the manual controls. "Not like this." Without thinking, I dropped to the floor beside her, helping stabilize the vents, recalibrating the humidity, doing everything she taught me even though my own heart was racing uncontrollably. We worked like two halves of the same mind, moving quickly, deliberately, refusing to let panic win. But in crises, truth has a way of slipping out raw and unfiltered. At one point, Kennedy slammed her hand against the metal table, tears spilling from her eyes. "Why does everything I love always end up at the edge of collapse?" she cried. "Why does everything I try to protect slip through my fingers?" I grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at me. "Kennedy, stop. You didn't cause this, and you're not alone." She shook her head, voice breaking. "I can't lose them. I can't lose you. I'm always the one holding on while everyone else lets go." Her confession punched the air out of my lungs. "Hey," I whispered, grounding her. "I'm not going anywhere, not now, not ever." Something in her softened then, like a wounded animal finally accepting safety. And in that fragile moment, I realized something monumental. The storm wasn't in the greenhouse. It was inside her, and inside me. Two people terrified of losing what they'd barely begun to build. We managed to stabilize the habitats, saving every one of the fragile lives she had fought so hard to protect. But the emotional fallout lingered long after the lights came back on. Afterward, we sat on the cold lab floor, leaning against the same table we'd been fighting to keep warm just hours earlier. Her head rested on my shoulder. My hand rested over hers. The entire lab hummed with restored electricity, but inside us, different currents were finally settling. And in that long, aching silence of exhaustion and relief, I understood something clearly for the first time. Falling in love with Kennedy wasn't just about discovery. It was about learning to stay when everything inside me screamed to run. It was about letting someone see the most uncharted parts of me, and trusting them to stay, too. But the world has a cruel way of testing fragile things. And our biggest test was waiting just around the corner. The days after the greenhouse incident moved slowly, like the moments between thunder and rain. There was a stillness to everything, a kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful but fragile, like glass pressed too hard between fingertips. Kennedy and I went through the motions. We met at our usual cafes, exchanged our notes on the grant project, even laughed sometimes, but something had shifted. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it was there. In the way her fingers hovered near mine but never reached any more, in how she started double-checking her calendar when I suggested meeting up. We were both pretending not to notice the space forming between us, but I could feel it settling around us like fog, thick and unyielding. It wasn't a fight that caused it. Not even the night her voice cracked in fear over the butterfly habitats. It was something deeper, something older than either of us. It was the collision of her need to be known and my fear of being exposed. I kept thinking back to that moment in her apartment, when she'd looked at me with those unguarded eyes and asked not to be hidden. I wanted to promise her that I would never hide again, but wanting wasn't the same as being ready. And the truth was, no matter how many times we kissed, no matter how many late-night conversations we had under stars or fluorescent lights, I was still scared of what people would say when they found out. Not because I was ashamed of her, God, never that, but because I was afraid of losing the version of myself I'd worked so hard to build. The version the world had applauded and accepted. The breaking point didn't come with yelling. It came quietly, the way most heartbreak does. It was a Sunday afternoon. We were supposed to meet at her lab to finalize the new overlays for the conservation panel we were preparing. I arrived 10 minutes early, hoping to surprise her with her favorite lemon muffin from the bakery near my apartment. But when I walked into the greenhouse, she wasn't alone. A woman was there, tall, confident, striking in a way that made my heart stutter for a second. She was laughing, leaning in close to Kennedy, pointing at one of the butterfly enclosures. And Kennedy, she was smiling in that way she did when she forgot she was being watched. I froze. It wasn't jealousy. Not exactly. It was more like panic. A wave of realization that maybe I wasn't the only one hesitating. Maybe while I was busy being afraid, Kennedy had started to move on, to imagine a life where she wasn't waiting for me to choose her in full. I stood there longer than I should have. When she finally turned and saw me, her smile faltered, just for a moment, but I caught it. She introduced the woman as Alina, an old colleague from her research program in Costa Rica. "She's in town for a few days," Kennedy said, her voice careful, as if testing how much truth I could handle. I forced a smile and nodded, but something inside me broke. The next day, I canceled dinner plans. Then I missed our video call about the migration mapping. When she texted to ask if I was okay, I replied with something vague and polite. I told myself I was busy. I told myself I needed space. I told myself this wasn't a breakup because we'd never officially defined what we were. But every excuse was a lie. The truth was simpler. I was running, again. And Kennedy wasn't chasing me this time. 2 days passed, then 3, then 5. The silence between us was no longer accidental. It was chosen, and it hurt in a way I hadn't expected. My apartment felt colder, emptier. I caught myself glancing at my phone every hour, hoping to see her name flash on the screen. I listened to her old voice notes on repeat, her laughter, her passion, her soft curiosity. I started walking past the lab, lingering just out of sight, hoping maybe I'd catch a glimpse of her through the glass. I didn't. She wasn't there, or maybe she was hiding too. Then came the letter. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was handwritten, delivered by courier, folded once down the center. The envelope just said, "Amelia." Inside, Kennedy's handwriting was familiar and devastating. "I'm not writing this to end anything. I'm writing this to let something go. Loving you has been the most honest thing I've done in years. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't an experiment. It was a truth I never expected to find in this life. But I can't be the only one holding the weight of what we are. I need to love someone who doesn't flinch when I reach for their hand, who doesn't shrink when the world turns its head. I need to be someone's beginning, not their pause. I hope one day you understand that this wasn't about being with a woman. It was about being with me, fully. And if that day ever comes, you know where I'll be. Until then, take care of the maps." "'Kay." I stared at the letter until the ink blurred. I read it again, and again, until the words etched themselves into the back of my mind like roads I'd never traveled but somehow recognized. It wasn't a breakup letter. It was a mirror. And in it, I saw the worst part of myself, the part that let fear dictate the terms of my happiness, the part that had finally found someone worth staying for and still chose the easier path of silence. That night, I walked for hours, through streets I knew too well, past coffee shops where we'd once sat, parks where we'd watched butterflies together, alleys where we'd kissed like the world didn't exist. And at some point, I stopped walking. I stood still in front of a closed bookstore, Morrison's, the place it had all started, the place where two voices had answered the same question at the same time. And I whispered into the empty street, "I don't want to lose her." The next morning, I didn't go to my studio. I didn't check my messages. I didn't eat. I sat on my floor surrounded by all the maps I had worked on this past year, charts, overlays, paper fragments of history. They were beautiful, detailed, precise. But they were all missing something. I picked up the map Kennedy and I had built together, the butterfly migration overlay, and held it to my chest like it was a photograph of a life I hadn't finished living. That map was more than just ink and data. It was us. Every curve and line a trace of her laughter, every color a memory of how her hand had touched mine, how her voice had told me to be brave. I closed my eyes, and for the first time I admitted something I had been terrified to say even to myself. I loved her. Not in theory, not in curiosity, not in fear. I loved her with the kind of clarity that made everything else feel like noise. And if I didn't find a way to tell her that, out loud, in full, with no apologies, I would lose the best thing that had ever walked into my carefully controlled life. So I stood up, I took a deep breath, and I started drawing a new map. Not one made of coordinates or terrain, but one made of truth. One that led straight to her. In the days that followed Kennedy's letter, time moved in a strange, disjointed rhythm, as if the world had slowed down just enough to force me to face every truth I had spent my entire life avoiding. I lived in a haze of regret and longing, drifting through my apartment like a ghost searching for something it had already lost. Everywhere I looked, she was there. On my drafting table, her notes were still clipped neatly beside my sketches. On my bookshelf, her grandmother's journal sat with a pressed butterfly wing marking a page she had once read aloud to me. Even in my kitchen, the empty corner of my counter seemed to wait for the lemon muffins she always brought, as if the air still held the memory of her laughter. I felt her absence the way a body feels phantom pain, intensely, irrationally, constantly. And I knew then that love wasn't a choice I got to intellectualize or analyze anymore. It wasn't something I could sketch into a neat diagram or fold into a compass rose. It was something alive, breathing inside me, demanding movement, demanding truth. And if I didn't act, I would lose her forever. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I reached out for help. I called Sarah, voice trembling, and the moment she heard me, she didn't ask questions. She came straight to my apartment with takeout, a notebook, and the blunt honesty only best friends were allowed to wield. I told her everything. About the bookstore, the hikes, the kisses, the fear, the silence, the letter. I cried in a way I hadn't cried since childhood, messy, uncontrollable, the kind that breaks something open inside you. She listened quietly, her expression shifting from concern to heartbreak to a kind of fierce protectiveness I didn't know I needed until it enveloped me like a blanket. When I finally finished, she placed her hands on my shoulders and said words that pierced straight through the fog of my confusion. "Amelia, you didn't lose her because you loved a woman. You lost her because you didn't let yourself love her openly." The truth hit me with the weight of an anchor. I had spent years building my life around certainty, around clear categories and rules and expectations. I'd always prided myself on being strong, capable, independent. But in doing so, I had built a life where I didn't allow myself to be vulnerable, where I didn't let anyone see me fully, especially not in ways that challenged the narrative I thought the world expected from me. Loving Kennedy didn't just break a rule, it dismantled an entire identity I had spent years shaping. But the cost of holding on to that old identity was losing the one person who made me feel truly alive. And suddenly, the choice wasn't complicated anymore. It wasn't about labels or explanations. It was about letting myself be seen, and being brave enough to say, "This is who I love." That night I barely slept. Instead, I spread every map I had ever restored across my floor, ancient sea charts, trade routes, exploration logs. I traced the lines with my fingers, searching for something symbolic, something true. Maps were stories, after all, tales of people who dared to travel beyond what they knew. I needed to do the same, so I created something new, not a request from a client, not a restoration, but a confession, a map not of places, but of moments. I drew the bookstore where we first spoke, the cafe where she told me she believed in getting lost, the trail where she kissed me under a sky bleeding gold, the greenhouse where she cried when the temperature controls failed, my apartment window where I watched her walk away after our last fragile attempt at honesty. At the center of the map, in delicate lettering, I wrote, "Every path leads back to you." When I finished, dawn was breaking through my curtains, painting the paper in soft pink light. It was imperfect. It was emotional. It was vulnerable. It was everything I had avoided being, and it was hers. So with trembling hands, I rolled it carefully, tied it with a thin ribbon, and set out to find her. What I didn't expect was the emptiness of her lab. When I arrived, the greenhouse was dark, the gate locked, the air strangely hollow. I checked the cafe where she liked to get her iced lavender lattes, no sign. I checked the library where she sometimes worked on her field notes, nothing. The panic that rose in my chest felt suffocating. Had she already left? Had she moved on? Was I too late? I stood outside the locked greenhouse door, gripping the rolled map like a lifeline, and for the first time in weeks I let myself say her name out loud. "Kennedy!" The silence that answered felt like a verdict. I didn't know where else to go, so I drove to the one place that had ever made both of us feel grounded, her grandmother's garden. The place she spoke of in reverent tones, the sanctuary where her love for butterflies had been born. It wasn't a formal garden, but a small plot behind her childhood home on the outskirts of town, filled with wild flowers and fading wooden markers from decades of observation. When I arrived, heart pounding, I didn't see her immediately, but the gate was open. And that was enough to pull me forward. She was there, sitting on an old stone bench, her hair pulled into a loose braid, her face tilted toward the sky as if searching for answers among the clouds. She looked tired. Not physically, but in that emotional way a person looks when they've been carrying too much for too long. The moment she noticed me, she stiffened, her expression torn between hope and caution. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice quiet, as if afraid the garden itself might collapse under the weight of her question. I stepped closer slowly, giving her space to walk away if she wanted. "I needed to see you," I said. "I needed you to hear me." She shook her head, not angrily, but with a grief that made my chest ache. "Amelia, I can't go through the cycle of hoping and hurting anymore. I can't keep waiting for you to choose me when you're scared of being seen with me." Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. "I love you," I said. The words left me before I realized they were forming, soft but certain, like a compass needle finally finding north. She blinked, stunned, and for a moment neither of us breathed. I moved closer, knees shaking. I love you, I repeated, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say it. I've spent my whole life hiding parts of myself to fit a story I didn't even write, but loving you, it changes everything. And losing you made me realize that the only story worth living is the one that scares me, the one that's real. Her eyes filled and she looked away, shoulders trembling. Then why did you run? She whispered. Because I was terrified, I said, voice cracking. Not of you. Never of you. I was terrified of being seen for the first time. But the truth is, I don't want a life where fear decides who I get to love. Slowly, I unrolled the map. Her breath caught when she saw it. Every place we touched each other's worlds was there, drawn with care, labeled with memories only we shared. At the center, the words glowed under the morning sun. Every path leads back to you. Her hand covered her mouth as tears finally slipped free, quiet but heavy. Amelia, she whispered, as if my name were a fragile thing she didn't dare hold too tightly. I stepped closer, offering the map with trembling hands. I choose you, I said, fully. Without hiding, without fear. She studied my face for what felt like an eternity, and then she reached out, not for my hand, not for the map, but for my cheek. Her palm was warm, her touch was gentle. I've loved you from the moment we said the same answer in that bookstore, she whispered. But I couldn't keep building something alone. I covered her hand with mine. You're not alone anymore. The space between us closed slowly, naturally, like the final stroke of a painting that had been waiting for completion. When our lips met, it wasn't like the first time or the second. It wasn't tentative or searching. It was certain, deep. A kiss that unfolded like a truth neither of us needed to hide from anymore. The garden around us shimmered with new life, butterflies drifting lazily through beams of sunlight as if bearing witness to our long-awaited reunion. It felt like the world had finally exhaled with us. But as beautiful as that moment was, life doesn't transform in a single kiss. And love doesn't resolve itself in one confession. Our biggest test was still coming. Because choosing love is one thing. Living it openly is another. And the world wasn't ready for who we were becoming. But we were. Together. There are moments when the world doesn't ask if you're ready. It simply opens its hands and places everything you feared, longed for, and avoided into your chest and waits to see what you'll do with it. That's what the days felt like after the garden. The days after the kiss that wasn't born out of confusion or curiosity anymore, but out of decision. The morning we sat there beneath the arch of sunlight and memory, my confession lingering in the air like the scent of blooming milkweed, I thought maybe we'd finally crossed the last great divide, that everything broken had been repaired. But love isn't just choosing someone in the quiet, in the sanctuary of a private garden. Love asks to be chosen when the world is watching, when it's loud, when it's inconvenient. And Kennedy, though she never demanded it, needed to see if I could do that too. The opportunity came faster than expected. A week later, we received an invitation to present our migration map again, this time at the National Climate Innovation Forum in front of an audience far bigger and more public than either of us had faced. I almost declined. I almost let fear dictate the reply like it always had. But Kennedy placed the invitation on my desk without a word, and I knew this was more than a speaking engagement. It was a mirror, a test. A moment asking, will you hide again, or will you finally stand beside her, fully seen? So I said yes. The weeks leading up to the forum were electric, almost painfully so. We worked together more than ever, rehearsing our talk, refining every line, anticipating every question. But under all the preparation, there was a different kind of work happening inside me. The kind I couldn't rehearse. I found myself calling my mother again. And this time, I didn't avoid the truth. I told her everything, not just that I was seeing someone, but that I was in love with her, that her name was Kennedy. That I wasn't confused or going through a phase or rebelling. That I had found the one person who made me feel more myself than I'd ever felt. My mother didn't respond at first. The silence on the other end was a chasm, but then she exhaled slowly and said the one thing I never expected. You sound more sure now than I've ever heard you. It wasn't a blessing, but it wasn't rejection either, and for now, that was enough. The day of the forum arrived with a sky so blue it felt ceremonial. We stepped into the auditorium together, side by side, our notes tucked under our arms, our hands brushing briefly as we moved through the crowd. I could see the tension in Kennedy's shoulders, not from nerves, but from hope she hadn't yet dared to voice. She didn't need me to announce anything. She didn't need a banner or a declaration. She just needed to know that when I stepped on that stage, I would do it with her, not as a colleague. Not as a friend, but as someone who had finally stopped hiding. We were scheduled midway through the day, slotted between a keynote on oceanic preservation and a presentation on Arctic seed vaults. The crowd was bigger than I'd imagined. Researchers, journalists, students, donors, cameras, bright lights. It should have terrified me. But standing backstage with Kennedy, I felt something else, clarity. The kind of clarity that comes not from confidence, but from knowing what you're doing matters. Not just for the data or the science, but for the story, our story. When they called our names, we walked up together. Two women, two voices, one truth. We presented like we always did, fluid, balanced, passionate. I spoke about history, about forgotten roots and lost cartographies. She spoke about change, about fragile species and shifting winds. We passed the mic like we passed energy, seamless and real. But when we reached the final slide, the map we had created together, I paused. I looked at the audience, and then I looked at her. Before we close, I said, heart pounding, voice steady, I want to say something that's not in our notes, something that matters as much as any chart or migration path we've shown today. The room quieted. Kennedy turned her head slightly, eyes wide but unreadable. This map, I continued, gesturing behind us, is a story of movement, of change, of adapting in a world that often doesn't make space for the fragile or the new. It's also a personal story of how I met someone who showed me that maps don't just record where we've been. They show us where we're brave enough to go. I turned toward her fully. Kennedy Murphy, working with you changed the way I see the world. Loving you changed the way I see myself. And I want everyone here to know that, not because it's political, not because it's radical, but because it's true. Her eyes filled, my hands trembled. This isn't just our work, it's our life, and I'm done pretending it needs to stay hidden. There was silence for a heartbeat, maybe two. And then the room erupted into applause. Not the polite kind, the kind that starts as shock, then swells with understanding. The kind that carries gratitude, the kind that holds space for truth. Afterward, Kennedy didn't say anything. She just pulled me close in the wings and kissed me, not out of passion, not for show, but like a compass returning to north. Like home. And I knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same, because love, once spoken aloud, cannot be unspoken. It echoes. In the weeks that followed, everything changed, but not in the dramatic, cinematic way I once feared. We went back to our work. We finished the grant. We took walks at sunset and read aloud from old journals and kept a rotating butterfly habitat in my studio window. I introduced her to my friends. She invited me to her mother's birthday. We fought sometimes. We miscommunicated. But every night we found our way back. And one day, not long after the forum, she handed me a small gift box. Inside was a brass compass. The same kind I'd used on our first hike. But on the back, she had engraved a single line. The only map I trust is the one we're drawing together. I looked up at her, tears rising. And I said the one thing I now believed with my whole heart. I'm not lost anymore.